we finished up our work on Ravenholm, we couldn't shake the feeling that the transition from Eli's lab just wasn't working. It was far too abrupt. Eli's lab connected directly to the streets of the town where you'll be shortly, and the section you're standing in didn't exist. We had just made this promise at the end of Eli's lab: we don't go there anymore. And we liked the overall build-up we'd created. But when the player got to Ravenholm, they were immediately dropped into combat with zombies without any room for tension building. So we built this section and the subsequent tight corridors to address that in a way we were happy with. We slowed the pacing, focused on art and lighting, and got you ready to experience why we don't go to Ravenholm anymore.
Ravenholm Gameplay Focus. After watching many playtests of Ravenholm, we knew the core gameplay of the level revolved around the gravity gun and physics. Once equipped with that knowledge, we felt we could appropriately build the transition into Ravenholm and help the player learn and understand a bit about what the upcoming experience would be. This happens often. We build the level track, figure out what's working, and then design its prologue. We built the following set of rooms with that table setting in mind. The brutality of the tools we provide the player seemed to aid in setting the mood we were striving for, helping to shift the tone from the safety of Eli's lab to something darker and more frightening.
Bringing physics to the enemies. The physics traps in Ravenholm were some of the first gameplay elements in the level that we were really happy with, but they lacked player agency. It was the saw blades that helped us figure out what Ravenholm was truly about. With saw blades, the player was able to bring physics to the zombies instead of leading zombies into the physics. Once we had that understanding, Ravenholm evolved rapidly. We kept combing through the map, looking for anything, especially anything unusual, that could be turned into a tool or weapon for the player.
Player tools. By this point in the game, players have a lot of experience with Half-Life 2's physics, but they've just received the gravity gun, which provides a whole new way to interact with the physics objects in the game. We iterated on a variety of the physics objects that the player could play with, things like saw blades, the catapults, explosive canisters, traps, spears, and so on, and honed in on the ones that worked well with the physics gun and cut the ones that didn't. Then we went about stripping the levels of ammunition items so that the player had to rely on these objects to survive.
Contrived setups. There's a pretty obvious contrivance in a bunch of the gravity gun and physics object training. The player pulls a saw blade out of the wall with the gravity gun, and right on cue, a zombie stumbles around the corner, just begging to have a saw blade launched at it. Then the player crawls under a spinning blade trap to turn it off, and suddenly 3 zombies appear, taunting the player to switch the trap back on. We didn't have much time to iterate on this section, so we needed setups that worked for all players, not more open-ended ones that relied on them making the right move. While this kind of design has the potential to reduce players' creativity, in this case, we found that they didn't seem to mind that we forced their hand a little bit.
Paint cans. Once we started to succeed at making the gravity gun and physics gameplay the core of the Ravenholm experience, we started to go through the levels and look for objects that we might have overlooked as we were busy working with the really aggressive things like saw blades and exploding canisters. One of the things we found was the paint can, and it was simple enough for us to sort of reinforce player expectations by having the paint can splatter paint on the zombies when you threw one at them.
May they become like the wind. May the angel of the Lord pursue them.
Ravenholm's development. We began developing Ravenholm early in the production of Half-Life 2, so it went through more than one full development pass. The first version predated the gravity gun, with gameplay focused on traditional zombie combat using guns and some of the physics traps. We even planned to showcase Ravenholm at E3 in 2002, but the game was ultimately unveiled a year later in 2003. By that point, we had invested heavily in Ravenholm's art, something which we generally avoid until the gameplay is fully proven. So once we went back to Ravenholm with the gravity gun mechanic in mind, we were working with a lot of pre-existing level geometry that had been designed with a very different gameplay goal in mind.
Misteaching flinches. Another memorable playtest and example of the danger of misteaching players occurred in Ravenholm. One of our design principles is for the game to respond to the player as much as possible. So when designing the gravity gun, it seemed obvious that if the player pointed it at a zombie and pulled the trigger, something should happen. It was simple enough to make it zap the zombie for a tiny amount of damage, causing the zombie to play its flinch animation, which felt good and responsive. Later, we watched a playtest where the tester discovered this interaction immediately upon arriving in Ravenholm, and interpreted it as a feedback that the gravity gun was hurting the zombie, which it was, just not very much. So they zapped the zombie again, repeatedly, shocking it over and over until it died. This is a slow, unfun, inhumane way to fight zombies, especially where you're surrounded by saw blades and explosive canisters. Having learned our lesson, we removed that flinch animation, even though it meant losing that interaction between the zombie and the gravity gun. In this case, it was better to not have the simple interaction, rather than give the false impression that the gravity gun was an effective way to fight zombies. Even simple principles can require trade-offs when you get into the details.
Grigori Plaza. This open plaza is one of the areas that was fully detailed in our first development pass. When we returned to it, we wanted to preserve as much of the existing art as possible while designing a new player path that used all 3 dimensions, moving players up and down, through windows, across rooftops, and between buildings. It wasn't a large space, so we had to squeeze as much track out of it as possible, and since that started as an art-focused area, it was light on gameplay and we needed to address that playtesters tended to fly right through it. And to top that off, it was already pushing our rendering performance budget with little room left for anything new. The challenge became finding small additions to slow the player down by adding threats around corners and into every nook and cranny of the level. Fire trap. This fire trap was originally intended as a visual showpiece for the fire system before a level designer repurposed it as a gameplay element for Ravenholm. It was almost cut many times during development due to the performance impact on the low-end PCs because of all the overdraw involved with the transparent sprites. In the end, there was a programmer who felt that it was important enough to the gameplay that it was worth doing the work to solve the performance issues and make sure we could get it into the game.
Hallway cupboards. These junk-filled hallways were a simple solution to our need to slow the player down. With the constraint of preserving as much of the existing geometry as possible, combined with slow-moving zombies as the main enemy, it was tricky to stop players from just sprinting through here. Luckily, having Grigori as the crazed inhabitant of Ravenholm made these setups easy to justify. It makes good sense that he'd clog the stairwell to keep himself safe on the rooftops. In the end, Grigori's solution and ours were one and the same. Just throw a bunch of furniture in the way, because if it stops zombies, it'll probably slow the player down too.
Poison head crabs. This room unintentionally introduces poison head crabs. We'd spent a lot of time crafting their proper introduction later in the level, but once we saw how well they were playtesting, our excitement got the better of us, and before too long we'd scattered them throughout the level. By the time we realized they'd appeared before their intro, it was really too late to rework it. Fortunately, a tight room of poison head crabs works as decent training, because their design avoids a common issue with combat training. Typically, players are stressed, and they can get frustrated if they die repeatedly without understanding why. And sure enough, we encountered that problem when trying to train the player with both poison head crabs and their source, the poison zombie. However, poison head crabs can't kill the player by themselves, so while stressful, a room full of them at least avoids that frustration.
Even with all the work we did to try and make a connection between this lever and the outside electric fence in the players' minds, some testers would still flip the lever and not know what they'd done. They'd even wander around, flip the lever back on, and wander around some more. With not much time to spend on making the connection clearer, we elected to just have the lever break off. This prevented players from undoing their progress and added to the feeling that Ravenholm was an unreliable and decaying environment.
We all went to Ravenholm. When fans talk to us about Half-Life 2, Ravenholm is often the most remembered section. Thanks to its multiple development passes and the density of the material in it, more members of the team are represented in Ravenholm than anywhere else. It was where we figured out how to apply our artistic pipeline to the set pieces and mood we wanted. how physics and gameplay combined with the gravity gun, how headcrabs and zombies need to evolve for Half-Life 2, and much more. Looking back on it now, it reassures our belief in individual empowerment over centralized design. Ravenholm is dense, highly efficient in its gameplay and artistic execution, and the sum of many small contributions by individuals who understood how they could push it just a little further with their own unique capabilities.
Car crushers. These car crushers required some adjustments and quite a bit of work to our physics damage system. There's always a challenge when big physics objects interact with non-player characters. For instance, if the physics can push the NPC, it might shove them somewhere they're not supposed to go, leaving them unable to recover. This isn't a big issue for something like a headcrab, which can just hop out of a tricky situation, but for something like a zombie, it could mean they get stuck and end up helpless, flailing away in whatever gap they manage to wedge themselves into, which kind of kills the survival horror mood we're going for here.
Car crusher lifts. Getting the car crushers to lift the player was also tricky. See, the player is always being simulated by both the physics system and the game's movement system. Each time we update the player's state, we compare the results from both systems and decide which one is right, then sync them up and repeat. This allows the two systems to influence each other. Like when the player stands on a seesaw, the physics lets the board give way, or when they stand on the car crusher, it lifts them up. While more complex, this dual system approach was easier to tune than trying to handle both physics and player movement in a single system. By keeping them separate, we could fine-tune the player movement system to feel good on its own, only reconciling the two when physics was affecting the player.
Pacing switch. Now that the player's through the training section, we can start shifting the pacing from moody, claustrophobic spaces to more combat-focused action arenas. With the player familiar with the various physics tools in the environment, we can start mixing those into open spaces and just give the player the freedom to choose their approach.
Tables and bodies. Towards the end of Ravenholm's production, with all the major pieces in place, we went through and tried to fill out every bit of empty space with something interesting. In doing so, we had to be careful to use what we already had and not create anything new, as we couldn't risk introducing more bugs. Often, as in this room, we were trying to add new moments of gameplay, while also adding more detail and storytelling to the area. Small scenes like this allow an attentive player to think about what they're seeing and what it might mean for what they'll encounter next.
Fast Zombie Introduction. This space was another area originally built for E3 2003, where it showcased the player fighting against a squad of Combine soldiers. When we returned to use it to introduce the Fast Zombie, we tried to keep as much of the previous work as possible. We wanted an iconic moonlit shot with zombies leaping past the moon like werewolves to draw the player's eye. Once that beat is over, we introduce the first Fast Zombie to the player space and send it at them. It took a lot of iteration to find the right balance of lighting for the scene to look good, while ensuring it also worked for the gameplay goals.
Physics object consistency. All physics objects have a variety of parameters that define their behavior, their mass, the amount of damage they take before breaking, what they break into, and so on. During development, these parameters were specified by level designers for each item, which is how most things in the game worked. But later in development, we realized we'd created a problem for ourselves. There were thousands of physics objects in the game, and no method to ensure consistency across them. As a result, a cardboard box might break apart with a single pistol shot in one level and be completely invulnerable in another. Internally, we generally referred to these inconsistencies as level designer crimes. To fix these, and to deliver some justice, we built a system that enforced consistency on all physics objects based on their visual model. Since most of the game had already been built, we were forced to allow level designers to explicitly opt out of this system for rare edge cases where they needed to do something criminal to preserve what they'd designed. Internally, we refer to these designers as recidivists, some of whom perpetuate their life of crime at Valve to this day.
Poison Zombie Introduction. Constraining the player in a tight space while providing them with a view outward is a useful way to increase the chances that they'll notice something we want them to see. Here, we draw the player's attention with the sound of a whale before the poison zombie itself becomes visible. Originally, this encounter was also the first time players faced poison headcrabs, but as mentioned in an earlier node, we got far too enthusiastic in proliferating poison headcrabs around the level and ended up spoiling their joint introduction here. In the end, however, these first encounters worked better as separate instances anyway.
Gamma correction. Our game engine has a rendering system that's responsible for taking the entire state of the game and calculating a color value for every pixel on your screen to represent that state. But code and software from other people are involved in the process of calculating those pixels as well. As an example, the software and hardware in your GPU and monitor. At one point during development, we were unhappy with how our characters looked. In particular, we thought that they looked waxy or sickly. Their skin was wrong. We spent some time tuning our lighting, but we just couldn't get both our characters and our world to look right. Luckily, we still had a fully featured software renderer, which allowed us to run the game without a GPU, because this was an era where many players still didn't have one. And looking at the game on that renderer, we noticed that our lighting didn't have the same problem. So we went through our code with a fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out where our rendering code was doing something wrong when it was working with a GPU. After failing to do so, we tried talking to the GPU manufacturers, asking them to double-check they weren't doing anything wrong with the pixel values we were passing them. That was the start of a long journey, and long story short, it was a journey of almost 2 years of back-and-forth communication with GPU manufacturers before we were able to convince them that they were doing gamma correction incorrectly in the low-level math on their cards. During this, we'd even had to build a system that validated the color values of an individual pixel throughout the entirety of our rendering pipeline. But eventually, at the end, we finally got new drivers back from them, and our characters immediately looked like they should, matching the software render.
At this point in Ravenholm, the player has learned all the gameplay elements available to them and can predict their interactions. This allows us to build more complex setups, providing a greater level of threat and more freedom in how the player can approach each scenario. This arena is a deliberately entwined space that the player will need to explore, and we use that exploration time to slowly ramp up combat intensity. The faster the player explores, the faster we ramp it up. The freeform nature of this design made it challenging to tune, given the large dynamic range in how players played through it.
Playtester archetypes. Iteration and regular playtest were the lifeblood of Half-Life 2's production. Every week, we'd quietly watch over the shoulder of a player going through the section we were working on, taking notes on what worked and what didn't. It was important for us to test with a wide range of skill levels to be sure that we weren't making decisions that only worked for some. Over time, we learned to choose specific types of playtesters based on the development stage we were at. Early on, we used experienced gamers, usually teammates, who could handle rough, unfinished areas and were good at explaining their thought process. For combat testing, we'd find players of all skill levels, especially those creative in their usage with the tools. Finally, as sections became more polished, we'd focus on beginners, people who didn't play games much or weren't familiar with first-person shooters. Even if they weren't necessarily someone who might buy the game, we often learned something valuable from watching them.
Final Arena. When we finished the first pass over Ravenholm, this rooftop was intended to be the culminating fight. Like other spaces in Ravenholm, it had begun life as a space purely focused on being an interesting visual location. We felt it was important that, as the player left Ravenholm, they had a moment to look back over the town they had just survived and get a glimpse of where they were headed next. Multiple gameplay groups took a shot at building a fight here, but the tight geometry and performance constraints meant we never really created a finale we were happy with. Not unlike the Half-Life saga itself, it seemed as if Ravenholm was destined to not have a real ending.
Response rules. We knew early on that we wanted a lot of dynamic dialogue in-game, so we needed a system to handle it effectively. We aimed for a system that allowed sound designers to add and tweak lines without involving programmers, made the dialogue tightly responsive to the game's state, and minimized repetition. With these requirements, we created the response rules system. Whenever a character speaks outside of a choreographed scene, this system determines which line to deliver. Rather than picking up lines directly, character AI is constantly flagging opportunities for speech whenever a relevant event happens. spotting the player, getting hurt, firing a last round in a gun, encountering overwhelming enemies, and so on. With each opportunity, it sends the response rules system a packet of data about the game's current state, and the system returns the most fitting dialogue line, if there is any. This setup allowed our sound designers to create a detailed decision matrix for dialogue. For example, a character might have a different set of lines for announcing a reload while under fire versus after the end of a fight, or if only one ally is left standing, or if there's a strider in sight, etc. By the time we shipped Half-Life 2, we felt we'd only scratched the surface of this system's potential. It became a core feature of Episode 1's Alex, and went on to power the dynamic dialogue in our later games, including TF2's classes and the cast of Left 4 Dead.
The real final arena. Very late in the development of Half-Life 2, when we were reviewing the entire game for final improvement opportunities, we decided we did, in fact, want a real finale for Ravenholm. The rooftop fight wasn't enough. After some discussion, we chose to add this final fight through the graveyard with Grigori alongside the player. It was risky, development-wise, but we felt the game needed it. Since we were near the end of production, we had a mature set of gameplay tools to work with, but even more importantly, by this point, we understood our own game. Making a game is often a process of learning what it is you're actually creating. Why is our game fun? How is it different? What are the most important elements? As we built the game and watched playtesters go through it, we learned answers to those questions and, in turn, got better at making it. So the graveyard came together quickly and required far less iteration than many earlier areas of the game.
The complex route the player takes to safely navigate this mineshaft gives them plenty of time to see what's waiting for them at the bottom. And surprise, it's headcrabs. Honestly, it's often headcrabs. But in this case, it's poison headcrabs, which are fun by themselves, but a real riot when you add fast headcrabs into the mix. These two guys make a great combination. Neither is particularly dangerous on its own, but together they're incredibly lethal. Once poisoned, a single hit from a fast headcrab is enough to kill the player. And this is what biologists call symbiosis. At least that's what we think.
Sniper Alley. This section of game track was added late in development, after we moved Eli's lab and Ravenholm to come before Coast. While you might think that we build the game linearly, we actually split up into 3 different groups and worked in parallel on different sections, starting mostly in the middle of the game. Each group's first pass focused on nailing down the core of their section before they moved on. And then once we had a rough version of the whole game laid out, we went back over each section to polish it, adding successful elements from other areas and removing what wasn't working. In some cases, such as in Ravenholm, entire sections were moved. And then, after Ravenholm was relocated, we needed a new piece to connect it to the coast, which is the area you're entering now. Given the time constraints, this short section was built using existing, proven gameplay elements, like snipers and combine soldiers.
Half-Life 2's physics gave us a variety of tools to make combat more exciting. For instance, when enemies miss the player, we subtly redirect their shots toward breakable objects nearby, adding mayhem and creating that action movie feel. We also employed physics to add hints. We created what we called ragdoll magnets across the game to make enemy corpses fall in interesting and dramatic ways, such as off ledges or into the path of a train.
Snipers. The Half-Life 2 team was never very large, so we were always looking for ways to create new gameplay without high asset production costs. The sniper is a great example. It has no actual model, just a laser beam, so it required no art or animation support. When it dies, it simply spawns a Combine Soldier ragdoll and launches it out the window. Despite that simplicity, we got a lot of unique gameplay from it. We were especially happy with how it interacted with the physics objects in the game world. Players are used to exploiting explosive objects near enemies, so it felt fitting to have an enemy that flipped that dynamic when the player was in cover.
Coast kickoff. This interstitial scene came along late in development to connect Ravenholm to Coast. Noticing a trend? Quite a bit of the connective tissue in our games comes together late. In this case, that meant cutting corners wherever possible. We didn't even have time to animate Alex on the monitor. These kinds of scenes are always a challenge to make interesting, and we didn't succeed with this one. It's a good example of what happens when NPCs are treated like signposts without adding character to them or the scene. The result is a forgettable moment where the game's seams show. But that's the nature of development. You only have so much time, and you have to decide where to spend it. Kleiner's lab and Eli's lab were much more important, so that's where we focused our efforts.
Over here, Dr. Freeman.